Hi folks, this is Naughty Boy. Welcome to my honeydew workshop. I saw a lot of people doing their own videos on YouTube about ordinary things around the house, around the workplace. And I figured I could do just something as well as they could. So me and my son Andy decided we would film the replacing of our very old, very 70-ish cook stove in the kitchen. And because of YouTube's time constraints, we're probably going to have to break this into two parts. So I guess what follows here is going to be part one. And hopefully we can get the rest of it edited and part two up as soon as possible. And I always hear the other YouTubers say, like and subscribe. Well, that's up to you. If you like it or if you don't, or if you want to subscribe or don't. But as they say, the more the merrier. Hope you enjoy it. If you got any comments, please leave them below. I'll try to answer any questions. And I don't suffer trolls or fools. So, I guess that's it, and here we go. YouTube experiment with home video. Today we're going to do a much maligned chore that anybody can do, and you don't have to pay a repairman or the handyman a couple of $100 to do this for you. You can do it yourself. We've got an old stove, which is over here, and we have a not so old stove we're going to replace it with. Picked it up on Craigslist for $40. It's about 20 years newer than this one, and hopefully it'll work about 20 years better. Decided not to fix this one because it had a problem with an eye that turned out not to be the problem with the eye. I literally welded a pot to one of the elements, and in doing so, it's either shorted out the control unit or burnt one of the wires into somewhere. And then a short time later, a second eye stopped working. So we decided it was time to give this 1970s vintage much needed rest at the scrapyard. Not going to the dump. We'll get a little bit of money out of it. Won't be $40, but it'll be close. Since we knew we were going to replace this, it hasn't been cleaned in a while, say 3 or 4 days. But first step, of course, is to make sure that everything is off. And second step would be to remove current burners and the burner trays, which simply lift and pull. Just a couple of contacts that meet up with the socket, which is down in there. Not such a good picture, but maybe we can get one on here we've already removed. There's the socket. So after almost 50 years, it's time to replace the whole thing. So just remove the eyes. Those usually go in the garbage. And that's it for ready for removal. And most of these stoves, ovens, are all drop-in. They're mostly 30 inches. Unless you've got one of the really good cook stoves from days older than this one, which are about 40 inch, which I would love to have, but don't have the room for it. So now we're going to pull this out and show you how to change the cord. On this particular stove, our power source is all the way down at the bottom of the wall. So this one has an extra long cord that has to be folded up and goes underneath the stove. And that's not such a big deal as long as you keep the warming pan where it's supposed to be with good clearance. So we're going to unplug this and remove the cord.
Under both corners.
Now granted, the floor doesn't look that great, but in case yours does, here's a quick little tip on how to keep your oven from scratching your nice floor. Take an old cardboard box from the soda cans. Can we see it, please? Just rip it up, put the slick side down, lift up, and slide it under the nice metal scratchy foot. Do that on each corner. And that'll protect your nice glossy floor or carpet. God forbid you have carpet like we did, but That's an easy tip on how to keep you from marring your nice finish on your floors. All right, we already mentioned the extra long power cord, which if you ask any old timer, they call them a bull's tail because they're thick and they're heavy. And this one's kind of long. You may not need one this big for yours, so use the shortest length possible that gives you enough room to pull it out and pull it loose, because otherwise you'll have to climb in that hole behind the stove to put it in, and that's not an easy thing to do. So make sure you have enough length to get it in the socket before you drop the stove in. And now we're going to remove this cover so that we can get access to the terminals that we're going to remove the cord from and pull the cord off. Another handy item to have around the house is a multi-tip screwdriver. A lot of them you find these days, they have the automatic changers. Not worth a crap. All it is a gadget to make you say, oh, I want one of those. But this one has removable tips that can be double-sided or single-sided in some cases. This one happens to be double-sided. But the best thing about it is you get a nut driver here in the end of the tip, which is typically 5/16, which is the size of most nuts on most appliances made in America. Not that metric crap from overseas. So we'll use this to remove the screws on the cover. But the other handy part about these is they're also reversible. And we have a removable bit on this end. The handy thing about this particular one, this one is made by Stanley, I believe. No, Klein, which is a well-known, good quality screwdriver. Buy all the cheap crap ones you want. They won't last you more than 1 or 2 projects. This one has a ratchet in it so that you can manipulate the bits or the screws without having to actually take your hand off the handle, which is extremely handy in some cases. But in general, I leave mine locked in the middle so I can twist it either way whenever I want. Some of your newer stoves will actually have not only a hex head screw, but they'll also put a slot in it so that you could use a standard screwdriver. This being from the 70s, it's old style, no slot. And now the cover's off. You can read the warnings if you're educated enough to read English. Basic common sense. Something in rare supply these days in some places. Now, this part can be particularly scary for some people because it's electricity, but since it's unplugged, we don't have any danger of shock, so we don't have to worry about that. And I'm going to flip it over on its face to make it easier to get to the terminals. Pause it. Another quick, easy tip for moving these things around inside your house that you don't want spilling out. Tape the pesky door shut. Sometimes it might not stick too well from all the grease that's on it, like this one, but it's usually enough to hold it in place until you can get it outside and get it to the dump or recycle it, which you should do. And we'll tear off another piece to the other side. All right, pause. For novices, I recommend that you actually read the installation instructions on the back of your stove, which most of them have nowadays, or at least used to. Some of the newer stuff might not have any of any consequence, but most of them will at least give you some easy to read or easy to see instructions or diagrams on how to wire it. It's not very good with this camera phone, but the real meat is over here on the terminals, and a lot of them will use hex head bolts. This one in particular uses screws, so it's still not a problem. It varies from maker to maker, so all I can say is watch your fingers, because slotted screwdrivers tend to slip out on you very easily. Now, on electrical appliances such as stoves, we have 220 instead of 110. And basically it comes from your breaker or fuse box and comes up to your outlet that you plug your cord into. And you have two 110 lines and a neutral. And you can tell by the color code on these that this is 110 because it's black. This is neutral because it's white. And this is also 110 because it's red. And if you notice, there's no green because it's not grounded. It's actually grounded through your breaker box on the neutral line, but it's not physically grounded through your outlet or on your stove because ground is actually part of the circuitry. So we'll go ahead and remove these in preparation for putting this on the replacement stove. And as I noted earlier, it's real simple. Got some screws here. You're gonna loosen them all. And on your cord, the neutral line is always in the middle. Now this cord may actually be labeled as to the specific terminal that you should attach it to, but not always. And these always are not squeezed. These are squeeze terminals, which means when I tighten this, there's a jaw underneath that comes up and squeezes onto the terminal on the cord. Not all of these do that. Some of them, in fact, most of them that I've done in the past, you actually have a round lug on the cable. And we should be able to pull that out here in just a second. Looks like I'm going to have to take them all the way out. Looks like this one does double duty. Both, not only does it have a jaw to clamp it, but it's also using the screw going through the lug. And this one's being stubborn, which is not unusual. Alright, as you can see, we've got lugs on the end of these, which have a hole in them, which the screw goes through, and then it goes into the jaw. So you're doing both a screw and a jaw. On a lot of older, or like I said, depends on the manufacturer, you may just be putting the lugs here and putting the screws, or as it might be, hex heads, bolts, through those eyelets into the contacts. And that's basically how you remove a cord. And we'll cover on how to install it on the next one as soon as we get these swapped out. All right, now we've moved forward in time, probably 30, maybe 40 years. We got a nice diagram. No indication of when it was made though. I'm gonna guess probably 2010-ish maybe. No real way to tell. They don't date them like they used to. Got some instructions that bear worth reading if you've never done this kind of thing. And there's our guard that the cable is going to get installed on. And nowadays we have Phillips. Not slotted, not hex head, but Phillips. Should be pretty easy piece of cake. We got 2 on this one instead of 3 from the other one. So I'll remove that and we'll be right back. Alright, screws are out. And off it comes. Pretty effortlessly. And on this one, we get nuts. No screws, but nuts. So we've got black, white, and red, just like on the other one. And on this one, you can see they've actually grounded the return line, or the neutral. So this one is actually physically grounded, unlike the other one. Alright, be right back once we get the cable in and ready to tighten the nuts down. Once again, trusty screwdriver has come in handy. Once we remove the bit, we have a nice open, not 5/16, but this is probably 7/16, and fits nicely on our nuts to remove so we can install the cord. We'll loosen these up pretty much all the way. They're already fairly loose. And one of the things you want to look for when you're installing electrical equipment is corrosion. I don't know if you can see it really well, but this line happens to be kind of corroded. If I were to install this without removing that corrosion, that ends up becoming resistance. And when you have resistance, as in, say, a coil in an oven or a stove, that coil gets red hot. So if you leave nasty little corrosion, that will turn into resistance, which turns into heat, which ends up in a bad connection, and you end up losing a lot of power here instead of on the coil inside the stove to heat your food. So make sure you check all your contacts and make sure they're nice and clean and burnished with no crud or gunk or corrosion or calcification or whatever nasty little boogers might be hiding. So make sure you clean those off before you tighten anything down. Okay. As I was mentioning, you need to remove the crud and corrosion off these, and the kitchen just happens to have a handy piece of steel wool, which is perfect for burnishing copper. In this case, brass. A few quick scrubs, and make sure you check both sides of your connectors. And this one, kind of cruddy too. Looks like our stove decided to pee in the floor. What the? Must have had a little rainwater in it. And we'll burnish these a little bit. Corrosion off of it. And if we can get a close-up now of this, now that it's clean, bright, shiny brass. And now we just got to put these bad boys back in place. And remember, the center wire is your return. And 210 on each of the other legs. And now we put our nice brass nuts on there. And make sure you don't leave any of the steel wool strands across the contacts or the terminals. Granted, it's probably not going to do much damage, but it might scare the crap out of you or make a nice little puff of smoke the first time you turn it on. So make sure you don't leave any of those steel wool hairs, strands, whatever, hanging around to cause you grief. You want to make sure you torque it down pretty good, but you can't torque it real hard because these screws are, of course, made out of brass. And if you've got a little bit of forearm strength, it's not hard to snap them off, and then you're really hurt. So we'll torque those down nice and tight. I'm sure there might be some technical specifications of foot-pounds, but if there are, I've never seen them or heard of them. Just make sure you torque it down nice and snug. And then, of course, we'll put our guard back on. Got a couple little slots right here. Got some tab A in slot A. If you ever made any paper airplanes when you were young, slide her up, that latches them in. That's the way they cheat on using a lot of screws. They tend to be just cheap little slots in the sheet metal. And, you know, it might only be a couple of cents for each screw, but when you make a million of them, that could run into a couple of $1 million. So that's how they make them cheap these days. You don't really care as long as it gets out the factory and doesn't fall off when you get it home. Get that nice and tight. Alright, we've had a short break while we got the stove in. Had a small wrinkle in that our eye that came with the stove is not exactly intact. It's missing the support that holds the eye over the opening. So we plan to replace it with this eye, which, by the way, is not an exact replacement for this one. This is one that I pulled out of the old stove. So I took my little Dremel tool and I cut down the edges because it was too wide. It wouldn't fit in the opening correctly. So we whittled those down on all three sides. and we went ahead and got it to fit. So before we continued with this little destruction, I decided to check the resistance of the old eye to make sure that my new one was somewhat compatible. So when I got the eye and the meter out, and we put the meter across the eye to see what we're measuring, and lo and behold, let's turn this puppy on. There is no conductivity. It's a complete open. And upon further inspection, I find that there's been a slight blowout, which is not exactly easy to see. This camera doesn't focus up close real well. But for the most part, you can see where the eye had a small blowout, probably from the old support that was underneath it. So this is going in the garbage, and what we did after that was I pulled one of the small eyes. Now granted, small eyes have less cow rod and they produce less heat. So we decided to check the value of the resistance on those, and our meter tells us that they are 45 ohms, 45 and a half, close enough. So that's going to produce quite a bit of heat with 220 running through it. So that looks to be intact. And as a comparison, we're going to do the measurement on the replacement eye to find out what kind of resistance it has. Now you notice the contacts are a little bit different. These have flat pieces of brass instead of the eyes from the other one, but they slide into a socket and do pretty much the same thing. Now in measuring this one, we find that it is 23 ohms. That noise you're hearing is from my meter. I can do basically diode checks on it. It has a little tone that once it goes under a certain resistance, it emits a tone. But in this case, if we could get our technician to have a good contact on the paddles, we'll find that its resistance is 23 ohms, approximately half. But he can't seem to get a good contact for some reason. Yeah, we'll pause here and come back in a second. Oh, come on. I haven't moved. Our technician is having difficulties. So I guess that's technical difficulties. But anyway, the rough estimate on our ohmage on this one is about 23 or 24 ohms. Tip it. Now that I've replaced our technical difficulties with a real technician, you can see we have 23 ohms of resistance. So I feel fairly confident that this should work relatively well. If not, it's going to be a big smoke party. And now we'll continue in a moment once we get it hooked up. Alright, now we've got our bull's tail plugged into our 220 outlet, and of course it's still hooked to the stove. Now all we got to do is drop that puppy in place.
I suppose so.
And here we have it, fully installed. All the eyes work, even my Frankenstein eye. And we check both oven elements, they both work. Fully functional stove with a modified eye for 40 bucks. Can't beat it with a stick. And it's probably 40 years newer than the one we took out. So maybe we'll do a follow-up in a month and find out if it's still working. So stay tuned for more household handyman tips.